We're discussing the rarest, most desirable, most collectible Rolex watches on the market today. Let's start with some ground rules. First, you should treat this guide as a starter pack for future research. It's a user-friendly way to get into the best of the Rolex catalog. We'll cover a lot of insider terms, but including every little esoteric detail like Z serial numbers, Mark V dials, flat forwards, or fraud foot logos in an exhaustive list would be exhausting, not to mention impossible. Next, we've tried to include more relatively affordable watches when possible. For example, we'll talk about rare and expensive Paul Newman Daytonas, but we'll also include more attainable Zenith Daytonas. Universal bonus points refer to any qualities or details that almost always increase the desirability of a watch, so we won't mention it every time it comes up. Watches in excellent condition with unpolished cases are always going to be more expensive. Watches with stamps from Tiffany & Co., special issue governmental stamps, or even Domino's pizza logos will always be more expensive. You'll see similar phenomena with gilt dials and often with tropical dials or faded ghost bezels. If you combine a few of these into one watch, then you have a compounding effect, creating exponential market value. These factors can apply to almost any watch on the list, so we won't repeat them every time a new watch comes up. We also won't really discuss prices because the market is always changing, collector taste is always changing that market, and for rare Rolex, the market rates really vary, not just reference by reference, but by each individual watch. For a general sense, you can scroll to the bottom of a Chrono 24 listing page for, say, an Explorer reference 1016 and see how prices have fluctuated over time. Finally, we'll largely skip over precious metal and gem set watches. These are expensive watches due to the materials used, so if you sort by price from low to high on Chrono 24, you'll see modern solid gold Submariners side by side with rare vintage versions, but the latter is ultimately more collectible than the former. Rolex created arguably the world's first waterproof wristwatch in 1926 with the Rolex Oyster. We say arguably because there was emergent evidence that lesser-known companies created this technology about a decade or so before. In 1927, the brand made international news when English swimmer Mercedes Leitz completed her 10-hour swim across the English Channel wearing a Rolex Oyster. In 1931, Rolex introduced their first automatic movement featuring a rotor that spins 360 degrees. The first ever automatic watch is also up for debate, but the patented Rolex system laid the framework for essentially every automatic movement that followed. With these two technologies, waterproof cases and self-winding movements, you have the two most important pieces of DNA for Rolex sport watches. These daily driver watches were ready for anything you could throw at them, and they would run accurately for years and years if worn frequently. Because the Oyster Perpetual lineup has long been on the entry level of Rolex sport watches, there aren't as many collectible variations as there are for the Submariner or the Daytona, for example. Still, in recent years, we've seen the rise of colored dial Rolex OPs with the Tiffany blue emerging as the leader. This colorful series of watches was made for only 1 year, which adds to their exclusivity. In 2023, we saw the release of the Celebration Dial OP, which has also become a modern favorite on the secondary market. For vintage OPs, you have the rare True Beat, featuring a mechanical movement that beats once per second. For comparison, modern Rolex movements beat 8 times per second for a smoother sweep. This True Beat function was marketed towards doctors to more accurately measure a patient's pulse. Not many of these watches were produced, and the specialized movements are not easy to service or find replacement parts for, so those that have survived have become quite collectible. The other two Oyster Perpetuals to look out for are any yellow gold examples with yellow gold bracelets, especially textured gold bracelets. And finally, the reference 1530 is a short-lived mechanical version of the Oyster Quartz. You may remember Rolex created the Oyster Quartz, featuring battery-operated movements to compete with the cheap and highly accurate quartz watches that were dominating the industry at the time. The 1530 is the best of both worlds combination of a mechanical caliber inside a very 1970s style Oyster Quartz case. Rolex is the best-selling brand on Chrono 24, and the Datejust is the best-selling model from that brand. It's the quintessential everyday luxury watch, and it's been an absolute classic since it debuted in 1945, the 40th anniversary of the Rolex brand. The Datejust was the first self-winding chronometer wristwatch to indicate a date in a window on the dial. The model was equipped with a Jubilee bracelet created specifically for it, as well as the distinctive fluted bezel. One quick way to find a collectible Datejust is to find a colored dial. Rolex made many more silver dials than they did for other colors, so black, blue, or even palm dial Datejusts will naturally be more collectible. Another relatively affordable way to get into collectible Datejust is to look for examples with 4-digit reference numbers like the popular 1601 in strong condition from highly rated dealers. For less affordable but even more collectible Datejusts, check out ones with stone dials, wood dials, or precious metal Datejusts on presidential bracelets. For added exclusivity, you can try to find things like bark bezels or bamboo bezels, but they're quite rare. Going back to dials, we did a deep dive ranking of dozens of Datejust dial variations in a separate video if you want to find a Datejust variation that's a little less common. Just be prepared to disagree with my ranking. Let's touch quickly on the Milgauss before moving on to the Explorer and the Explorer 2. The Rolex Milgauss officially debuted in 1956 and was designed as an anti-magnetic watch specifically for those who worked in power plants, medical facilities, and research labs. Before this, the accuracy of your mechanical watch could be compromised by electromagnetic equipment, so you either had to deal with a dysfunctional watch or not wear one at all. After some testing at the CERN facility, it was determined that the Milgauss could protect the movement up to 1,000 Gauss, hence the name Milgauss. And it did this using a soft iron Faraday cage to shelter the movement from magnetic interference. The case had to be a little chunkier to accommodate the Faraday cage, and the story behind the Milgauss isn't as marketable as the GMT, for example, so it was never a super popular watch. Still, there are some collectible Milgauss references. First among these is the original Milgauss, reference 6543, which was only made for a couple of years. The Milgauss comes into its own in 1956 with a reference 6541, when it added the signature lightning bolt seconds hand. These had either smooth or rotating timing bezels, and they featured waffle texture dials, which add a lot of value and collectability to any Rolex watch. You may also search for the later reference 1019, which was the last vintage Milgauss before it was discontinued in 1988 due to lack of sales. These are available in either a black or silver dial. The modern Milgauss that debuted nearly 2 decades later is much more plentiful. It was again discontinued in 2023 after slow sales, and while discontinuations normally boost the secondary market prices of watches, it had little to no effect at the time. So if you're looking for a collectible Milgauss, go vintage, but be prepared to pay a high price tag. In 1953, Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay wore Rolex watches now known as pre-Explorers during their summit of Mount Everest. Following this accomplishment, Rolex released the Explorer. The watch generally is not as collectible as the Submariner or Daytona or GMT because Rolex created it to commemorate an achievement instead of being the watch that actually accomplished these milestones. The most collectible Explorer is the reference 1016, which ran from 1960 to 1989. It wasn't the first Explorer, but it's certainly the most culturally important and is considered by many to be the most simple yet most beautiful Rolex dial. We won't go into detail here, but you can earn bonus points for finding details like frogfoot logos, underlined dials, or exclamation point dials. To go even further, you can hunt for an albino reference 6610 or for a Rolex Commando. The Commando was an entry-level watch made for only 2 years to be sold either through the US military or through Abercrombie & Fitch locations in the 1960s. This is back when Abercrombie was a reputable outdoor brand and not the Abercrombie of the early 2000s. Modern Explorers are less collectible, but one that stands out above the rest is the Blackout Explorer. After the 1016 came the reference 14270 in 1990, and it appears the very first examples to emerge from the factory had black enamel numerals at 3, 6, and 9. Many consider this the rarest Rolex with the sapphire crystal, and it's one of the hardest to find examples from the modern catalog. We'll touch briefly on the Explorer 2, which debuted in 1971. This is a watch designed for cave explorers who needed to know whether it was day or night while deep underground. Today, it's more commonly used as a GMT complication. The first reference for the Explorer 2 was the 1655. What's great about this watch is that it's one of the few Rolex sport watches to feel dated, and I mean this in a good way. Rolex watches are famous for being timeless classics, and yet this one feels more like a time capsule with a design that would feel out of place either before or after. These are often called by their Freccione nickname, which means big arrow in Italian, or they're called the Steve McQueen, although the actor never actually owned one. More modern collectibles include the Polar Explorer, known for its white dial. Collectors like these 5-digit Polar Explorers because white dials are quite uncommon for Rolex sport watches and because the dials can develop a very warm and pleasant patina to them over time. This patina process does not happen with the contemporary polar dials because the materials have been upgraded to prevent this from happening. The Glycine Airman was technically the first GMT watch and debuted in 1953, a couple years before Rolex, but it did not have nearly the cultural impact that the GMT-Master had. You could say that the Glycine created the category, then Rolex defined the category. After all, it's not about who does something first, it's about who does something better. This was the golden age of air travel, and in a brilliant marketing move, Rolex and Pan Am teamed up to launch the GMT-Master. This creates lore and legacy from day one. It's also important to note that this appears to be the first Rolex sport watch designed with luxury in mind. People were now able to cross entire oceans in one swoop, and they had a watch capable of keeping up with this new jet-set lifestyle. Debuting in either 1954 or 55, depending on who you ask, we see the first GMT-Master reference 6542. These watches originally featured bezels made out of an acrylic material called Bakelite that had radium numerals sunken into the plastic. These bezels were fragile and radioactive, and there was an American naval officer who sued Rolex in 1961, claiming the radium gave him cancer. Rolex had already replaced those Bakelite bezels with non-luminous metal bezels by that time, making the original Bakelite versions all the rarer. Also, for the James Bond fans out there, you'll know the 6542 as the watch worn by Pussy Galore and Goldfinger. Can we say that name? After the 6542 comes the most collectible Rolex GMT reference, the 1675, which ran from 1959 to 1980, one of the longest production runs in Rolex history. An easy way to tell the difference between a later 6542 and the 1675 is to look for crown guards on the side of the case. The early GMT Masters are known for their bicolored blue and red bezels, what we call a Pepsi bezel today. However, if you're after something a little different, check out a fuchsia GMT. Contrary to some rumors, these bezels were created in this color and not a byproduct of fading. Same but different, you could go after a blueberry 1675 with an all blue bezel. Just be aware that there is some debate among experts as to the authenticity of these. The blue bezels were never sold at retail stores, but could have been test bezels for Rolex service centers, or for special clients, or for a military order, or just plain aftermarket. Now, if you're not a Pepsi fan, you could opt for a reference 16760, known as the Fat Lady. Also, the first GMT with a black and red Coke bezel. The Fat Lady name refers to the thicker case required to accommodate the thicker caliber 3085, now with decoupled 12 and 24-hour hands. This allowed the 12-hour hand to jump in 1-hour increments forwards or backwards as the wearer traversed time zones without the movement stopping. Up next is the most collectible non-tool watch from Rolex, the Day-Date. This watch is also commonly known as the President, as it was a favorite of US President Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Ronald Reagan. Legend has it that Marilyn Monroe gifted John F. Kennedy a Day-Date with a special message engraved on the caseback. Quite the scandalous gift for a married man. Kennedy reportedly told his staff to destroy the watch, but it later sold at auction for $120,000, although there remain some doubts regarding its authenticity. The model is best recognized from a distance by its presidential bracelet, which is basically halfway between an Oyster bracelet and a Jubilee. The other defining feature is, of course, the day of the week displayed at the top of the dial. For an extra collectible version, look for non-Western day dates in Arabic, Hebrew, or Chinese perhaps. On the more affordable side of things, a 4-digit day date like an 1803 is supremely classic and will only cost you about a third of the retail price for its modern equivalent. There's a wide range of dial variations out there for the Day-Date, so a quick path to collectability is to find one with a stone dial, a wood dial, a Stella dial, a stamp dial, or one with unusual hour markers like a claw dial or a doorstop dial. Bezel and bracelet variations with a bark finish have also become increasingly collectible over the years. Now we arrive at what many consider not only the most important watch in the history of Rolex, but the most important watch in history. It's the Rolex Submariner. More than any other watch, the Submariner created the blueprint for dive watches and really for tool watches as a whole. It's top of mind when thinking about Rolex or luxury watches or watches in general. The Submariner has over a dozen references in its 70-plus year history and a few hundred variants, depending on how you slice it. With that in mind, let's build an overview of the most widely collectible subs on the market. 1953 is the birth year of the Submariner, alongside models like the Explorer and the Chronograph. This draft class of watches, with the sub as the leader, is the real turning point for Rolex as a maker of capable tool watches for daring environments. The sub was born in 1953, but wasn't officially announced or marketed until 1954. The first watch with Submariner on the dial is the reference 6204, featuring pencil hands and a relatively thin case. The signature Mercedes hour hand makes its way to the Submariner around 1954 with the 6205. About a year later, we see the reference 6200 with an Explorer dial featuring 3, 6, and 9 hour markers that resemble dials used on the Explorer 1016. It's speculated that only a few hundred of these were made, with even fewer surviving to this day. You can, however, find some Explorer dials on references 5512, 5513, and our Nest watch, the 6538. This watch is what many consider to be the most collectible Submariner, and that's the Big Crown, reference 6538, produced from 1956 to 1959. It's the watch that Sean Connery wore as James Bond in Dr. No, and it's easily recognized by the red triangle on the bezel and the Big Crown. The watch comes in both 2-line and 4-line versions, depending on whether it featured a chronometer certified movement. The Submariner with perhaps the best combination of collectability and attainability are the 5512 and 5513. The easiest way to tell them apart is whether the dial has 2 lines for the 5513 or 4 lines for the 5512. Some collectors prefer the cleaner dial of the 5513, while others prefer the superlative chronometer movements of the 5512. These sibling references had a combined 3-decade production run, and not to make a dive watch pun, but the variations go deep, with several dial and crown guard configurations throughout its history. The long production run means the 5512 and 13 aren't particularly rare, but they are relatively affordable, and they were significant for cementing a lot of the core Submariner design language with enough variation to keep collectors busy. In 1969, that's 16 years after the birth of the Submariner, we get the first sub with a date in the reference 1680. The watch featured the same movement as the early Sea Dwellers and featured a cyclops over the date, as well as the namesake red sub text on the dial. Finally, some of the most collectible subs in the world are Mil subs, named for their military specifications. These are most commonly 5513s, and the best examples feature minute markings all the way around the bezel, plus sword hands, plus fixed bars between the lugs, and an encircled T logo, meaning the watch used tritium lume instead of the more dangerous radium. There's one watch that's even more collectible than the Submariner. You know what I'm talking about. It's the Rolex Daytona. The Sub, the Daytona, and the Datejust are typically the first 3 watches that come to mind when people think of Rolex. And the most common progression for consumers is to start with the Datejust, then get a Sub, then work your way up to the Daytona. Although results and preferences may vary. I'm looking at you, GMT fans. The Daytona was not the first chronograph that Rolex produced, but it's been the only chronograph they've made since it debuted, and it feels unlikely that they'd ever replace it. Funny enough, the watch was not a commercial success, and really only started selling well around the time that the automatic Zenith Daytona came out in the late 1980s. We'll talk more about those later. Of course, it was the 2017 auction for Paul Newman's own personal Daytona that brought watch collecting into the mainstream when it sold for over $17 million. This is the moment that brought not just Daytona collecting, or vintage collecting, or Rolex collecting, but really watch collecting as a whole into pop culture. I've heard a rumor about a certain celebrity and Rolex collector who was the winning bidder, but that's not something we can discuss on camera. My personal favorite Daytona is the black dial pre-Daytona, reference 6238, although the first real Daytona is the reference 6239, which came around 1963. The watch measured 37 millimeters wide and featured the manual wind caliber 722, which was based on the famed Valjoux 72. The Daytona gets upgraded screw-down pushers with a reference 6240 in 1965. These increased the water resistance from 50 meters to 100 meters to match other Rolex sport watches of the era. This was also the first Daytona reference with a black acrylic bezel. During this time, we not only have a handful of dial variations being sold simultaneously, but also multiple references for the steel Daytona being sold simultaneously alongside each other in the boutiques. From 1971 to 1978, we have the now famous 6263 and 6265 references featuring upgraded movements. Screw-down pushers are now a permanent fixture of the Daytona, although we still have steel and acrylic bezels available. This is also the area where you get the highly collectible Big Red and Sigma dial variations of the SITS 2, SITS 3, and SITS 2, SITS 5. With all these different Daytona variations floating around simultaneously, you can see how experimental this period was for the model. Again, they were just trying to get it to sell. The most affordable yet collectible Daytonas are likely the 1 SITS 520 Zenith Daytonas, which ran from 1988 to the year 2000. They're called Zenith Daytonas because they featured heavily modified Zenith El Primera calibers, and ironically, they're more collectible than the following 1 SITS 520 featuring Rolex's first in-house automatic chronograph movement. For an extra dose of collectability, look for a Patrizzi dial Zenith Daytona. These feature a distinctive patina on the subdial rings that collectors love. Our focus has largely been on vintage, but when it comes to modern collectible Rolex, your prime suspects are the Rainbow Daytonas, the Green and Gold John Mayer Daytona, and the new Le Mans Daytona. These watches are collectible and expensive not just because the materials used, but because people like them and they're hard to find. But I don't need to explain to you how supply and demand works. Let's circle back to the 4-digit references and talk about what you've all been waiting for, Paul Newman Daytonas. When we talk about a Paul Newman Daytona, we're talking about these exotic dials popping up on 4-digit Daytonas. That dial is the only difference, but it's estimated that the Paul Newman Daytonas are 20 times rarer than their standard production counterparts. 20 times. These dials were made not by Rolex, but by a company called Singer, which is why you'll see, quote, Paul Newman dials on other non-Rolex chronographs. The rarity of these dials and their connection to one of the world's biggest movie stars is why they command such a high price tag at auction and on the secondary market. Remember that the Daytona was far from a commercial success when it was launched, and these exotic dials with higher retail prices were even slower sellers. In fact, you can find examples of sales receipts of Paul Newman Daytonas showing that they sat in the boutique for multiple years, if not a decade, before being purchased. If I only had a time machine. All right, we just scratched the surface, but that's kind of a core education as far as major model collectible Rolexes goes. There are more obscure, highly collectible Rolexes out there. We're talking bubble backs, stellene dials, zero graphs, turnographs. If you want to see a video like that, just let me know. I'll make it for you. Until then, I'll see you in the comments.